All right. Well, without further ado, welcome to this experiment in technology and training. So my name is Chandra Legui. I work for Oregon Wild. I've been with Oregon Wild for about 11 years now. I work in our Eugene office, so you can see some of my lovely decor behind me. This office in Eugene is where Doug Hyken and I do our work, mostly working on forest policy and management. So what we are here to talk about today is the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, and their draft management plan for Western Oregon BLM lands. That's why you're here, right? So a couple of introductory words. This live stream experiment will be archived so that it will be available to view later. I will try to do this in about 1 hour. So if you can't stick with it the whole time, please come back and watch the archived version so you can get a complete view of this. There is a forum for asking questions embedded just below the video on Oregon Wild's webpage. So if you are watching via Oregon Wild's website, that is the place where you can go in and type questions or comments. I will ask that you, if you're commenting in particular, be civil and kind, understanding that that I am not an expert in every single aspect of this, and that we are coming at this from Oregon Wild's conservation perspective, and I'm not trying to represent all perspectives. So don't slam me for not doing that. You can also email your questions to newsletter@oregonwild.org or use Twitter with the hashtag BLMPlan. And Erin, our communications coordinator up in the Portland office, will be submitting them to me. If there's anything that I don't answer while you're on here, or somehow you don't want to answer or ask in public, you can email me or call me later. My contact information is on the Oregon Wild website. What else to get started? Again, forgive any technology issues. This is an experiment. We've never done this before, so any feedback on that towards the end of this presentation would be appreciated. It might be a little glitchy in places, but hopefully we'll run it smoothly. And finally, I will try to define acronyms as I go along. There are some in my presentation, and I understand that I might slip into acronym speak, and we'll try not to do so. So I will be sharing my screen with a PowerPoint presentation for a good part of this, and I will stop periodically to check to see if there are any questions that have come in and see if I can answer those as I go. So your question might not get answered immediately, but I will try to come back to those as we go along. So let me get to a spot where I can share my screen with you. And I will start this PowerPoint in theory. All right. So I already told you who I am, so I'll stop going over that. So I wanted to start with just a background into BLM lands. So these are our backyard forests. On this map, you can see that there's a lighter color of green that really looks like a checkerboard if you were to zoom in. And those are Western Oregon's BLM forests. They have a very unique history. They can also be known as ONC lands, which stands for Oregon and California, as in a railroad that was to be built and was built back in a couple centuries ago. But because of their situation along the Willamette Valley and essentially the I-5 corridor, they very much are in our backyard, especially as we get south into Southern Oregon, south of Roseburg. and I-5 and a lot of communities are located right in the middle of that checkerboard land. So these are lands that we use for recreation. A lot of people get their drinking water from these lands. There's places to explore with your kids, places to walk your dog, places really in our backyard. So they're very special and meaningful to a lot of different people. There are a lot of different conservation values to be found on these BLM lands. This slide shows a study from the Nature Conservancy and the Wild Salmon Center that was done a few years back that found that over 83% of BLM holdings in Western Oregon have been identified as priority lands and waters for the conservation of native species and habitats. So though these lands total just 2.6 million acres, and actually that's not a small number, they are very significant for a lot of different things, as you can see in the slide. Wildlife habitat is one of the very most important of the values that these lands provide. They're home to threatened and endangered species, including the northern spotted owl, the marbled murrelet, the red tree vole, and lots of other species, big and small, from deer to salamanders to bats to songbirds. Public lands in general have the best habitat left, and BLM lands are no exception. The water that flows from our public lands, including BLM lands, provide habitat for salmon and trout. They especially need cold, clear water, and that's what comes best off of public lands with intact forests. People also rely on these lands for drinking water. Almost 2 million people rely on water that comes from BLM lands, including the Mackenzie that flows through Eugene and provides our drinking water. The photo of the people standing on the little dam, that's providing water to the Corvallis area, and that's coming from BLM lands. Recreation is another very important value of BLM lands. I mentioned some of the activities that people do with these lands just in their backyards, but there's also big wild places that people use and enjoy on BLM lands. The wild and scenic section of the Rogue River that I'm sure some of you have been getting out on or have plans to this year, brings in about $13 million annually to the local economy in Southern Oregon, and that's just from people using that section of river. These BLM lands are also incredibly important for storing carbon. This slide actually shows Forest Service land. It shows the Willamette National Forest and the Middle Sandiam Wilderness in particular, adjacent to private logged lands. And the darker the green, the more carbon is being stored. The light or white color is basically zero carbon being stored, and those are clear cuts on private land. In fact, our national forests, which are just on the outside of our BLM lands, if you will, as you go down the Willamette Valley, are some of the top carbon storing forests in the entire nation. And BLM lands, which you can see on this map, are the gold colored lands to the into the interior of the Willamette Valley, essentially, and down into the Klamasiski Mountains. Those are lower elevation in general than the national forests adjacent to them, which means that they, for the most part, have better growing conditions and are probably storing even more carbon, but the study that was done on national forests alone. So, what are we talking about with the ONC lands? I need to give you a little history so we can get into why there is a new plan, why we're talking about a new plan. So, in 1937, I'm actually going to not give you too much history. It can all be found on our website if you need it, but I won't go into the long and sordid history of why we have the checkerboard pattern, but suffice it to say that we have the Bureau of Land Management in charge of roughly every other square mile of land in the certain area of Western Oregon that amounts to about 2.6 million acres. And in 1937, a law was passed, the ONC Act, that said, what's up here, that these lands should be managed for permanent forest production, and the timber should be sold in the principle of sustained yield for the purpose of providing a timber supply, protecting watersheds, regulating stream flow, contributing to the economic stability of local communities and industries, and providing recreational facilities. So it actually is a multi-use mandate from this law, though many, and especially from the timber industry and counties, will interpret it as a single dominant use statute of providing a permanent source of timber supply. So we can split hairs later, perhaps. As I mentioned, these are 2.6 million acres of public forest land managed by the BLM. And not only does the ONC Act apply to how those lands should be managed, but other environmental laws do as well. The Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Wilderness Act, and the Northwest Forest Plan, a policy, not a law, that I will talk about in a few minutes. The ONC Act also ties logging on ONC lands to county funding, and I'll get into that a little bit later as well. I mentioned earlier that these are highly productive lands, being fairly low elevation, and partly because of that, for that reason, and partly because of the mandate that was seen to be given to these lands from the ONC Act, they were very, very heavily logged. This is a picture of some ONC lands off the highway just a couple of years ago. On our public lands in general, from the 1960s through the 1980s into the early 90s, clear cutting the forest was pretty much the lay of the land. We clear cut billions of board feet, and we're left with quite a legacy because of it. Let me check real quick if there are any questions coming up. Don't see any yet. So the Northwest Forest Plan was established once it became clear that the overlogging that was happening was putting at risk a lot of wildlife species, including salmon and the northern spotted owl. And logging kind of had to come to a halt because we recognized that we were putting these species at risk. And President Bill Clinton convened a bunch of folks to come up with a plan to solve the problem of endangered species and the fact that we had to stop logging for a time to protect them. So the Northwest Forest Plan was born, and it was an integrated management plan that combined both Forest Service and BLM managed lands into a comprehensive zoning scheme, essentially, for the forests in Western Oregon, Northern California, and Western Washington. Of course, we're just focusing on Western Oregon today. But the Northwest Forest Plan was broken into different land use allocations. Think of them as zones. There's late successional reserves or old growth reserves that were to protect and restore habitat for the species that depended on these old forests. Matrix lands were supposed to provide for timber harvest, while also upholding other environmental laws and providing multiple uses for our public lands. There were adaptive management areas where the agencies were supposed to try out different harvest methods, and riparian reserves, which set up a buffer along streams to allow for clean water and other habitat requirements of both species and vegetation along streams. And then there were also some other measures for doing analyses of watersheds, surveying for rare species, and if they were to be found, putting a buffer around their habitat so that they weren't harmed. And the aquatic conservation strategy, which in addition to the riparian reserves has a whole suite of standards that were to be met with any management of riparian areas. So the BLM lands were a very essential part of the overall Northwest Forest Plan schematic. And so on this slide, you can see in green, the National Forest Land. And and BLM land in gold. Oh, sorry. This is showing the old growth reserve system on both national forest and BLM land. The green is the reserve system, the old growth reserves that we're supposed to both protect and restore habitat for species that require this old forest. And so you can see that there are connecting points across the Willamette Valley and the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains that are green in the checkerboard. And so those were set up to provide for connectivity for those species, owls that were dispersing into new home ranges, for example, and try to connect the Coast Range and the Cascades. So the BLM was an essential piece of that. One second. Okay. So since the Northwest Forest Plan has come about, we would say that there has been a good amount of success. The rate of habitat loss has slowed as logging levels declined to protect those species that were in need. Forests are growing. A lot of watershed improvements and restoration have been made, so salmon habitat is improving. And there are also timber sales that have been moving forward. For the most part, those are, sorry. For the most part, those timber sales are sorry, technology minor glitch, trying to find trying to find my Hangout control, but I can't seem to do that at the moment. So so a lot of restoration has been done, and a lot of timber sales have been sold. Most of those have been thinning and young plantations that were clear cut in the past. And so there's not as much concern with those happening as there was with old growth logging that was occurring in the past. And for the most part, over the last 20 years since the Northwest Forest Plan was implemented, the BLM has actually come very close to meeting their congressionally funded targets, or ASQ, which is the allowable sale quantity, the volume of timber that the BLM is funded to produce each year, because there's a lot of planning involved, and so they're only funded to do so much. So for the most part, they've been meeting those goals, and so you could, in a lot of ways, say that the Northwest Forest Plan has been meeting its objectives. However, there were things about the Northwest Forest Plan that were not perfect, and here are some of our ideas for ways it could be improved. For example, it did not protect all of the remaining old growth forests, and that would be an improvement we would like to see. There should be, we think, more of an emphasis on restoring forest health and watershed health, so that they're resilient to disturbance and have all the structural integrity that they need to be functioning forests. And there are new considerations like climate change that weren't considered in the Northwest Forest Plan that could be considered today. So real quick, I'm going to check on you all. Hello. And for those of you watching or tuning in, just going through the slides, and I'm going to check again on the comments to see if there are any questions that have come up. Please feel free to use the comment box under the embedded file, the embedded video on Oregon Wild's webpage to ask any questions as they come up, and I will keep checking back. Looks like we don't have any at the moment. So I will go ahead and go back to sharing the screen with you. Let me get this back up to full page. All right, so that brings us to the plan today. Actually, hang on a second. This might not be. Here we go. Sorry, I'm trying to find the correct PowerPoint. There we go. Full screen. So that brings us to the plan today and where we are. So back in the Bush administration days, the timber industry sued over there not being enough timber being logged on BLM lands, and the Bush administration settled with them, and the settlement said that they had to do a new plan for the BLM lands to try to get more volume, more timber volume, and to consider doing something different than the Northwest Forest Plan. It didn't say that they had to change the Northwest Forest Plan, but to consider it. So that process was called the Western Oregon Plan Revision, WOPR, which we called Whopper. So you'll see that acronym up here. So the Whopper was developed over a 3 or 4 year period. Some of you listening or watching may have commented on that. Oregon Wild and a lot of other groups worked together to make sure that the public knew about this plan, what was in it, and commented to let the BLM know that they did not, in fact, want to see more clear cutting of our old growth forests, which is what that plan would have done. That plan was found to be illegal, and the Obama administration rejected it in 2009. It was pulled from the decision-making process. A new process, however, was begun in 2012 to revise the plans. And there was a scoping period. Again, some of you may have participated in that. There were public input sessions, and we tried to keep you informed and let you know how that was progressing. Last year, some planning criteria for the plan based on scoping comments were released. And then just a month or so ago, a 1,500-page document was released, the draft environmental impact statement or draft plan. And so we are currently in about the middle of the 90-day comment period. For that, after that comment period closes, the BLM will be taking all the information that we're going to send them and make a decision as far as what to do next, what their plan will actually look like. And that will, in theory, happen before the end of next year. So why is the BLM doing this plan? They did one a couple years ago. It didn't work out. There's a lot of public outrage. So why go through this process again? Well, they still feel that they need to increase timber production. They need to meet the ONC Act requirements of providing a sustainable timber supply and a predictable supply. That's something that they feel a lot of pressure about. But they also need to, and they recognize this, comply with other federal environmental laws, including the Endangered Species Act. So they need to conserve habitat. They also recognize that they need to respond to new information and change circumstances since the 1995 plan. And so they are doing this big analysis to try to do just that. Quick comparison, because I have had people ask me this. What's better, Whopper or this new plan? And the answer is, of course, that it's very complicated, and I'll go in a bit more about why it's complicated, but I threw this together to show some things side by side. The Whopper plan would have increased clear cutting by about 7-fold in old growth forests, and so it certainly did not protect old growth forests. The new plan also increases clear cutting. In fact, it mandates roughly 50,000 acres of clear cuts in the first decade, and it leaves about 300,000 acres of older forests available for logging. So depending on how you split hairs, those might be roughly equal as far as how bad they are. Under the Whopper, the reserve areas, that includes the riparian reserves and the old growth reserves, would have been reduced by about half. And we were not at all happy about that. Under the new plan, the reserve acres are actually about double what they currently are. So that's an interesting difference, potentially better. Under the Whopper, Stream buffer areas would have been reduced by about 75%, and that was bad enough. The current plan on the table would reduce stream buffers by 50%. That's worse. And the new plan also does some things that the Whopper did not, such as protect more potential wilderness areas. Sorry, I missed that. The Whopper would have increased timber harvest up to about 500 million board feet per year. The current plan on the table varies depending on the alternative, which I'll get to, but it would actually be quite a bit less than that under most alternatives. So one of the things about the Northwest Forest, or about this new plan, I'm going to call it Whopper Jr. for you because that's what we call it internally. One of the things that the Whopper Jr. Does is dismantle the Northwest Forest Plan. I talked about how the BLM was integrated into the Northwest Forest Plan landscape, and this takes it out because it changes the reserve system on both streams and old growth, and it's not integrated with the National Forest lands anymore. It gets rid of one of those important mitigation processes, the aquatic conservation strategy. We lose some of the strong restoration goal language that was in place under the Northwest Forest Plan for these lands. Some of the guidelines for how to do management on the ground are a lot looser than the standards. That's a much stronger word that were in place under the Northwest Forest Plan. And I'll get into this a little bit more later, but it gets rid of that survey and manage program that looks for rare species. And I'm going to pause again for a moment to see if there are any questions. So bear with me for a moment here. Has anybody entered any questions? Doesn't look like it. I'm answering everything perfectly. Wonderful. All right. Let me get back to my full screen. Okay, so getting into the meat of this plan. That's what you wanted, right? The Cliff Notes. And I'm already half an hour into this presentation. So I talked about how under the Northwest Forest Plan, it's a big zoning scheme. And there were different land use allocations that split the land into different pieces and said what you could do on those pieces of land. So this plan does the same thing, but it's just different than the Northwest Forest Plan. So there are congressionally reserved areas, so that means wild and scenic rivers, wilderness areas, and that's something that stays common across all the alternatives in the plan. There's something called district designated reserves, and districts are the different management units of the BLM. So there's the Roseburg district, the Medford district, the Eugene district. So each of those districts defined these reserves in their own way, but they're basically areas that aren't going to be used for timber production. There are lands that the BLM manages that are actually not in Western Oregon, and the way that they've defined those areas are areas in the Klamath Falls district area that are east of Highway 97, and they are kind of managed in a totally different scheme. They have late successional reserves, but they are defined very, very differently than the Northwest Forest Plan. So here's a couple of acronyms up here for you, and I will go into this a little bit more. Structurally complex forest, where there's no logging allowed. Large block forest reserves, which are essentially supposed to take the place of wildlife habitat in large blocks like the reserves in the Northwest Forest Plan, but they're configured very differently. And then they further divide those into moist and dry, so they have different things you can do in moist and dry. Riparian reserves, which I'll go into more in a moment, are all shrunk by half or more. That's one of the most concerning things about this plan. So what does this do to protect old growth forests? I mentioned this structurally complex forest term, so we'll just call that old growth. Each of the alternatives in the draft plan, and there are 5 different alternatives, including the current Northwest Forest Plan, define those differently. So in this little table, it shows how structurally complex forests are defined. So in alternative A, it means they're 120 years old or older. Alternative B is up to the district to decide, and they've put different things into how they define that, but I won't go into that here. And then some of the other alternatives are higher age threshold, and some of them are lower. So on this chart, you can see the different acreage, and those forests, those old growth forests, however they're defined, are completely off limits to logging under this plan, regardless of the alternative. However, there are other areas outside of the reserve system where there's a lot of old growth that are still available for logging. So that's the far right column that shows that, for example, under alternative B, 294,000 acres of forests over 80 years old, so essentially forests that have never been logged before, are open to logging, and rather intense logging at that, and I'll get to that in a moment as well. Real quick, I'm gonna, so I have a question I'm gonna stop for a moment and answer. What are the rare species that might be impacted by a BLM plan changes? I'm actually gonna answer that in a little bit further. And the other question that I have, I'm also going to answer in a moment. So bear with me, folks who asked the questions. I'll get there. So the riparian buffers. Like I said, this is one of the more concerning things about the plan. So they generally shrink buffers by half, and they move what used to be the riparian reserves that are no longer. They move that into the harvest land base, and I'm going to talk more about the harvest land base in a moment. And the impacts of reducing these streamside buffers are pretty big. I already mentioned the drinking water that people get, the fact that salmon rely on clean cold water, and reducing the buffers could impact those. And one key thing to consider is that the Northwest Forest Plan's riparian reserves they weren't just thinking about the fish. They were thinking about all of the other species, including things like northern spotted owls that are threatened, how they might use those streamside forests. It wasn't just about the fish, but also other species. And so reducing the buffers essentially is getting rid of their habitat as well. So this slide shows the actual streamside buffers to answer your question that's posted on the website. And there's a lot of jargon in here. This is kind of my my summary. So I will try to define it for you. So the SPTH stands for Site Potential Tree Height. So that's one of those technical terms used in the plan. It was used in the Northwest Forest Plan as well. So currently under the Northwest Forest Plan, there are 2 site potential tree height widths along each side of the stream that are protected by this buffer. Under a number of these alternatives, that gets shrunk by half to 1 site potential tree height on fish-bearing streams. So there's differences in whether streams have fish like salmon in them and whether they do not, whether they run year-round or whether they dry up in the summer. And so there's different rules on this. And so that can all kind of be seen on this slide. There's also, in this plan, an inner zone of the riparian. So even though it's shrunk by half, they're shrinking it even more by saying that there's an inner zone and an outer zone. In the inner zone, you can't log at all. And so, for example, on alternative B, there's a 60-foot inner zone where there's no logging, just 60 feet, as opposed to which is about half of the entire riparian reserve. Then the outer zone, outside of that 60 feet, you can thin or potentially, under some alternatives, do exactly the type of management that you would in the harvest land base, which I'll get to again in a moment. So there could be clear cuts in the outer zone of the riparian reserve, so not much of a reserve. We're still trying, you can see that there's some question marks in this table that say acres. That's because we're still trying to figure out what that amounts to. We know that what it means for those outer zones, that they can be logged potentially, but we haven't been able to translate that into acres yet. So we're still digesting this plan and figuring out some of this. So bear with us, and we do hope to get fact sheets with all this stuff up on our website soon as well. So getting to the harvest land base. This is the area that's essentially, under the Northwest Forest Plan, the matrix, where timber was supposed to be produced to supply the timber industry. So they've reimagined what this means and broken it out into a number of different types of logging that can happen in the harvest land base. That rates all the way from what they're calling the high intensity timber area, where you can clear cut leaving 0 trees standing, which is a much worse standard even than private forest land, which has to leave a couple trees per acre. Sorry, I got distracted by another question. There's uneven age timber management areas that are defined in a different way, medium intensity areas that also allows clear cuts but have to leave 5 to 15% of the trees. Still very much a clear cut. Low intensity timber areas that is more like, well, I'll show you a picture in a moment. And then under alternative D, there's something called owl habitat timber harvest area, which is supposed to allow logging but not damage spotted owl habitat. So the different alternatives, sorry, I apologize, I'm getting distracted by some technology issues on my computer. The timber alternatives are okay. The different alternatives produce different amounts of timber. Forgive me for that. The allowable sale quantity, or ASQ, is what the BLM estimates would be logged under each alternative in a given year, and it's measured in millions of board feet, and it only comes from the harvest land base. There's also additional volume that could come from thinning plantations in the reserve areas. So in the late successional reserves and from the riparian reserves, the outer zone, there's additional volume that could be generated there. And so the total volume for each of the different alternatives is shown here in this table. Under the Northwest Forest Plan, that number is actually can be quite high. They have not been logging that much, in part because they have not been clear cutting old growth, as is technically allowed under the Northwest Forest Plan, but highly controversial and not really been being done. Alternative B, which is the agency's preferred alternative at this moment, has 332 million board feet as their ASQ, or as their total volume. And you can see that there's a range from more than 500 million board feet under alternative C to, at the low end, alternative D, which only has 180, which is less than what is actually being logged today. Current levels of logging on BLM land is hovering around the 200 million board feet mark. So there's definitely an increase. I estimate that on average, we're looking at a 60% increase over current levels. So the bad thing about this increase in harvest is that a lot of it's going to be focused in these high intensity or medium intensity or even the low intensity timber areas in the harvest land base. And these pictures show the buck rising timber sale, which was implemented a couple of years ago. It was called ecological forestry because it leaves 30% of the trees behind in patches and also scattered around. So you can see that there are some patches here, but also scattered trees left. That's what would be done under the light intensity harvest area under this plan. And so you can see there's still a lot of impacts on the ground. You're opening up the forest and drying it out and removing most of the habitat for most wildlife species. So that's a big problem. We're estimating right now that we could see more than 6 square miles clear cut each year of this plan. So it's a dramatic increase, and in the context of the checkerboard where the BLM lands are often right next to private industrial forest lands that are being clear cut on a regular basis, this could have significant impacts for a lot of public values. I'm going to go into a couple of other impacts from the plan. The BLM actually does an analysis of how this increased logging would affect climate change. It's the first time that they've done that, in part because there's new direction from the presidential administration to do so. And they show that climate risks outweigh the benefits of this plan 2 to 1. And an analysis by the economist Ernie Nemi shows that that actually doesn't capture the complete picture, that they're not factoring in all the risk factors. And he estimates that the impacts could actually be up to 30 times higher than that, that the risks of this logging outweigh the benefits 30 to 1 or even more. And that the costs, so there's a certain number of jobs that, that this plan estimates that it will generate through increased logging. But the climate-related costs of that to society as a whole could be as much as $100,000 or between $100,000 and all the way up to $1.6 million. There's a lot of uncertainty, but the social costs are very high and potentially extremely high. This box on this slide shows an analysis done by Dominic De La Sala of the GEOS Institute. It was an analysis of Senator Wyden's ONC lands bill, which is different from this plan, and it has a bit of a higher timber volume. So this isn't a direct correlation, but as far as climate impacts go, he found that the increased logging would be the equivalent of adding over half a million cars to Oregon's highways, or burning 6.3 million barrels of oil. So the climate impacts, when you add them up over time, can be of this increased logging can be quite extraordinary. The wildlife impacts from this plan are also pretty high. I mentioned earlier that the survey and manage provision of the Northwest Forest Plan would go away, and that means that you don't have to look for rare species in an area that's about to be logged, and you may not know they're there at all. And so they lose protections essentially. Red tree voles, which are a cute little critter that lives in older trees and are a key food source for northern spotted owls, would lose protections throughout most of their range in Western Oregon, except for a North Coast population. The plan, and at least multiple alternatives of the plan, would have negative impacts for the marbled murrelet, would result in a direct loss of their nesting sites. You can see a murrelet here on an old growth forest or an old growth tree branch. They require very specific types trees and habitats, and logging and old growth would not be good for them. There's also negative impacts to the northern spotted owl. And one of the big things that we're concerned about is that even though official consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service to determine the impacts of the plan will be done, it's not done yet. And so we're being asked to make comments on this plan when we don't have all the information about what the impacts are going to be. One of the aspects of this plan that I have not had a chance to dive completely into, but I encourage you to, if recreation is something that's of concern to you, is the recreation areas. So they do have recreation management areas defined in the plan, and they're trying to actually, I've heard from the BLM that they actually would like more public engagement about recreation. They want to know where people recreate and what's important to them. And they're open to adding more recreation areas. So they want to know why you value these lands for recreation, and that would be a good thing to weigh in on. That's not technical. If you recreate in a certain area, or you want to have the opportunity to recreate in a certain way in a certain area, you know, please weigh in on that. It's really great for them to hear from people on the ground who enjoy these lands. Another aspect of the plan is defining lands with wilderness characteristics. So those are essentially areas that they're going to manage as de facto wilderness. They are, for the most part, large unroaded areas or adjacent to existing wilderness. In the plan, they include parts of the proposed Devil's Staircase wilderness, the proposed Wild Rogue wilderness, and several large areas in southern Oregon, which I'll show you a picture of in a moment. Different alternatives do different things here. Alternative A adds the most. It adds pretty much all of the areas that the BLM deems to have wilderness characteristics. Alternative B and C reduce some of that. They drop some of the additions to wilderness. And alternative D doesn't define them at all, which is very disappointing. So this is a screen capture of Southern Oregon BLM lands and the lands with wilderness characteristics that would be included in alternative A. So they're named on here, and you can see that they're pretty large areas between Ashland and Grants Pass and Cave Junction, and also the Wild Rogue Addition area. Another category of lands are the areas of critical environmental concern, or ACEC. They would be designated differently in each alternative as well. And you can see down below there that alternative A has the most with 105,990 acres. And these are areas that are special for a variety of different reasons. They call them relevant and important values. Some of you may even have been involved in nominating the addition of ACECs. And the BLM actually listened and decided to add a whole bunch more ACECs than what they had under the Northwest Forest Plan. So that's not a bad thing. There is actually a separate comment period on ACECs that ends in June and not July. I'll get more to how you can comment, but and I'll also get to the interactive map that the BLM has, and I encourage you to check that out as a tool to see where these areas of critical environmental concern are. Another impact from the plan are roads and off-highway vehicles, OHVs. There currently are about 15,000 miles of roads on BLM lands, and they have a huge maintenance backlog, about $300 million, that they would need to spend to fix up crumbling road systems, and they just don't have that. Under this plan, they would actually build hundreds of miles of new roads in the first decade, and you know, they would close some roads, but it would certainly not offset the roads that are planned to be built. Off-road vehicles are regulated in some ways better than they are under the Northwest Forest Plan. They're not allowed off roads, but they would still be allowed in many sensitive areas and on probably some of these new roads where they could do some damage. Getting into a topic that I most definitely am not an expert on, but I'm going to a workshop tomorrow in Salem on the socioeconomic impacts of this plan. I mentioned early on that BLM lands, ONC lands in particular, were historically linked to, or the timber harvest was historically linked to county funding. There's a 50% of timber harvest receipts goes to counties under the ONC Act. That, as you might imagine, led to a lot of revenue in the days when we were clear cutting many square miles of old growth every year. But due to that overlogging and the Northwest Forest Plan being put in place, those timber receipts necessarily dropped off. So as a stopgap measure, the Congress started allocating money to counties that were in this situation, the Secure Rural Schools Act, and has basically been paying the counties ever since to make up for this lack of revenue. This plan, this BLM plan, does not solve county budget problems, and it shouldn't. In order to actually solve or actually get back to the level of payments that BLM lands were providing to counties in the heyday of logging, you would have to dramatically increase logging, and that's just would wreak environmental havoc and would not be able to be done legally. Even to fund counties at current or at historic, I guess, secure rural schools levels, because they have gone down a bit in recent years, you'd have to increase logging a whole lot more than this plan does or could legally. And so we just don't feel that this is a solution to those problems. So the question that hopefully you're asking is, you know, there's 5 alternatives. I've talked about some of the differences in them. There's this 1,500-page document. What is the best alternative? What do you say to the BLM as far as, you know, what do we want you to do? And the answer is, of course, it's complicated. So there's actually no alternative in the draft plan that includes all the conservation measures we want to see. Even the Northwest Forest Plan alternative doesn't protect old growth and would try to do a bunch of clear cutting. What we do know is that the BLM does not intend to implement any one of these alternatives. They had to pick a preferred alternative, and they picked alternative B to put forward as their preferred, you know, the thing that they might go forward with. But they have let everyone know that they will end up choosing an alternative that's more of a mixture of different elements of these alternatives. So what conservation groups, Oregon Wild's working with a number of partners, what we're going to put together is an ask for a custom-made alternative that does include the conservation measures that we want to see. Some of those things might include protecting all the mature and old growth forests that have not yet been logged. So forests over 80, we might, you know, quibble over that number. We don't want to see any of this high intensity or moderate intensity timber areas that focus on clear cutting. We do want to see the full stream protections and aquatic conservation strategy standards that we have under the Northwest Forest Plan. We want to see an alternative chosen that protects the most lands with wilderness characteristics, areas of critical environmental concern, and wild and scenic rivers. We want to see an alternative chosen that has a focus on non-motorized recreation that would do less harm to the landscape. And we want to maintain programs like the Survey and Manage program that would protect rare plants and animals. So in crafting comments, these are some of the things you might consider. And Oregon Wild plans to do yet another alert with some draft talking points that you can use to ask the BLM or comment in this way. We see, this plan and any opportunity for revising the Northwest Forest Plan as something that we should be using common sense on. And from our perspective, the BLM should try to avoid controversy, and in order to be successful in management, they need to separate county funding from forest management and just kind of cut the ties there. Focus on maintaining and building the good elements of the Northwest Forest Plan, including things like protecting mature and old growth forests, and focus on restoration, which I guess I've already talked a little bit about. Down to the wire here, what can you do? You need to write comments on the plan. The comments on areas of a critical environmental concern and what should be included are due June 23rd. Overall comments on the plan are due on July 23rd. And again, we will be sending out more information, posting more information on our website when it's ready, including things like this PowerPoint. To help you make informed comments. You might be thinking, well, you just told me all this information, but I still don't feel like I'm an expert that I can make comments that the BLM is going to pay attention to or that are relevant. I can assure you that every comment is relevant. Think of it kind of as a pyramid, and the BLM is going to get a whole bunch of comments, hundreds, hopefully thousands of comments that form the base of this pyramid. That might be people like you that don't feel like they know a ton about this plan. They're not going to read the whole thing, but they care a lot about these lands. And hearing even short comments from a whole bunch of people to form the base of that pyramid is very important. As you move up, you might get fewer comments from people who are a bit more knowledgeable, have maybe expertise in wildlife or fish or specific concerns about forests adjacent to their property. And so there might be fewer, but longer and with more content. And then up at the tippy top, we're going to have the fewest comments, but really in-depth comments. And those are going to come from groups like Oregon Wild and Cascadia Wildlands and the Klamath Wildland Center. Groups that have expertise and will thoroughly digest this document and represent those of you submitting comments that form the base of the pyramid as well. So every little bit helps in letting the BLM know that there are people who care about these lands. There's information up here about how to comment. But there's also information on the BLM's website, which is pretty spectacular as far as information overload. There are also workshops and open houses still coming up that you can attend to learn more from the BLM. In fact, in Portland, there is a open house coming up on June 15th. Where you can go and learn a whole bunch more. And there are workshops on specific topics. I mentioned I'm going to the SocioEconomic workshop in Salem tomorrow on June 9th. Yes, on June 9th. But there are others on recreation, on riparian buffers, on wildlife, and on timber management coming up around the state. And those are on our website. Another way of just letting people know about this issue and the fact that this is going on is you can write letters to the editor. Those are seen by a surprising number of people, including politicians, who use them to gauge the general public opinion. So if you're up for writing a letter to the editor of your local newspaper, just saying something along the lines of, BLM Lands should be managed for a whole suite of public values and not just for clear cutting to produce timber, will go a long way. And then, of course, tell your friends that this is out there, direct them to our website or to the BLM's website, bring them with you to the open house or the workshop, and start spreading the word. Here is a list of the workshops that I'll leave up here for a moment. I have a question online about whether we're going to include some talking points, and yes, we will be doing that. We've definitely been meaning to get those up, but again, this is a 1,500-page document, and it's taken a lot to wrap our heads around it. So in the very near future, we will have talking points and some more tables and charts and other ways to break this down so that it's easy to understand. This presentation was an experiment in one other way of getting you information. So hopefully it has been useful, and you can use these other tools that we put online later as well. So hi, I'm back. Thank you for bearing with me and watching that presentation. Hopefully it provided a lot of good information for you and how this is how this plan is put together and some of the impacts it might have and what you can do. If you have any further questions that I did not answer, please feel free to email me at cl@oregonwild.org or give me a call in the Oregon Wild Eugene office. And we might also try to improve upon this presentation and put it online. So if you have any suggestions for how it could work better, including technology issues or how it was presented, please be kind, but we welcome constructive feedback. I think I will conclude there, unless actually I'll leave it open for any questions up on the comment page on our website if anyone has anything while I'm still broadcasting. I'll just wait for a moment. All right, well, seeing none at the moment, I will log off, but thank you again for being here and for getting involved in these very important BLM lands in our backyards. And I look forward to engaging more with you as the plan progresses and seeing your comments to the BLM. Thanks. Signing off.